Here's Anna and LaRue in front of the Appomattox Courthouse. She's a history buff. This is the McLean House. The McLean House was actually where they signed the treaty at. We'll get ready to go in it. Beautiful place down here. This is another view of the McLean House. This is where they signed the treaty for the Civil War.
And with them a shred of hope awaited the Confederates at a small railroad station on ahead. But the unprotected train soon fell victim to the predatory cavalry of General George Armstrong Custer. Unaware of this development, Lee halted the column at mid-afternoon. He moved off the Lynchburg-Richmond Stage Road, made camp, and established headquarters in a wooded grove. The date was April 8th, the 7th day of April. Lee and his army were near a small village, Appomattox Courthouse, a name soon to be printed in the minds of millions. About 9 p.m. that evening, an ominous rumbling reached the grove. It was the muffled roar of cannon, and it came from the west. Cannon to the west. It could only mean one thing: Federals to the front. They were across the Lynchburg Road. Grant had won the race. Lee's last council of war was held by firelight at his headquarters that evening. The result of this conference was a decision not unexpected to attack along the Lynchburg Road and attempt to reopen the route west. The infantry of General John Gordon would spearhead the attack. Lee knew his effort would be successful if and only if the force to his front was cavalry. With his men a mere shadow of their former strength, blue infantry blocking the road would mean certain failure. In the pre-dawn hours of April 9th, Gordon's men marched through Appomattox Courthouse en route to what was to be their last fight. The men formed in the fields just west of the village and attacked at dawn. Gordon's spirited advance was opposed only by cavalry. The Union horse soldiers fought valiantly, but soon gave way as the wail of the rebel yell echoed once more in triumph across the rolling hills of Virginia. The road was open. But even as those last shouts of Southern victory filled the air, the door to Lynchburg, the door to hope, was suddenly and finally thrown shut. Blue infantry began to fill the western horizon. They too were hungry and exhausted, but in numbers too great to challenge. Lee's decision had been made for him. Hopelessly trapped in a federal vice, he dispatched a note to Grant asking for a meeting to discuss terms for surrender. Flags of truce went out from Confederate lines. Gordon withdrew to the east, leaving the village interposed between the two armies. Union soldiers waited in hopeful anticipation, Southerners in agonizing disbelief. Lee, tired and alone with his thoughts, awaited Grant's reply along the Lynchburg Road about a mile east of the village. Near midday, a federal staff officer arrived with word that Grant was anxious to confer and that Lee should select a suitable location. Lee sent his aide, Colonel Charles Marshall, forward to the village. His mission, to find a stage on which the final act of war could be played. The village Marshall entered that day was a small one, rather plain and utilitarian in appearance. Until the arrival of the armies, its prestige had been purely local, derived from its status as the county seat of Appomattox County. Marshall glanced about for a building that could be used. He saw the dwelling of George Piers, the clerk of the county court. He rode past the small frame home of the widow Kelly and on in the direction of the courthouse, closed that day, Palm Sunday. Across the road was the Clover Hill Tavern with its kitchen and guest house. Several of these structures seemed suitable, but locating citizens who could offer them proved troublesome indeed. Of the town's scant population, only a few slaves could be seen. Wilmer McLean was the man Marshall finally approached that day. McLean was no stranger to war, having lived on the field of the war's first major battle at Manassas in 1861. Hoping to avoid the warring armies, McLean, a successful merchant, had moved to Appomattox Courthouse. Here he had thought a man and his family could avoid the shadow of war. Marshall, unconscious of McLean's past and anxious to complete his mission, asked if McLean knew of a house where the two commanders might meet. McLean's first choice was unfurnished and so rejected by Marshall. Then McLean offered his own home. The war, young and spirited, had found Wilmer McLean at Manassas. Now, after many months and countless miles, it had returned to his door to die. Lee's mind was heavy with the burden of disappointment as he rode through the village and entered the McLean parlor. He seated himself beside a marble-top table and waited, with Marshall, his only comrade in gray. A half hour elapsed before the clatter of approaching horses announced the arrival of the federal commander and his staff. Lee rose as Grant entered the room. They talked briefly about the Mexican War, a subject that put them on common ground. But the business at hand was that of surrender, and Lee, feeling the anguish of defeat, politely called Grant's attention to it. He asked that Grant put his terms for the surrender on paper. Seating himself at a small table, Grant began to write. As he did, this resolute, determined fighter, this lion in war, became a generous, artful architect of peace. His terms allowed Lee's soldiers to be paroled and returned to their homes. Grant allowed individual soldiers owning their mounts to keep them for spring farming. Shortly after an agreement was reached, the leaders parted. Grant saluted as Lee rode away. So was ended the 4-year tragedy of Civil War. It seemed ironic that this war, fought at so great a cost in lives, property, and human suffering, should end so simply. Lee did not offer his sword. Grant did not demand it. No theatrics were involved, no attempt at effect. Just two men, two good men, anxious to confront the inevitable and return the nation to peace. A gray mass enveloped Lee upon his return to Confederate lines. The cheers of his haggard veterans soon turned to sobs or muted groans as the object of his mission became known. Many had expected this result, but Lee's emotional acknowledgement was overpowering. News of the surrender spread rapidly through the ranks of the Union Army as Grant left the McLean house for his headquarters about a mile west of the village along the Lynchburg Road. Realization of the end manifested itself in various ways. Many a bearded veteran of the Republic, overcome with joy, tossed hat, haversack, and cartridge box into the air with shouts of exultation. Others danced about like children or wept unashamedly. Bands played, cannon boomed. No longer would the soldiers of either army fear shotted gun or saber stroke. Relief was universal as the specter of death was lifted from the field. Intermittent rain fell the following morning, April 10th, as Grant rode for a final meeting with Lee. The two leaders conferred on the crest of a small knoll just north of the Piers house. The conference produced an agreement that individual paroles would be issued to Lee's men as tangible evidence that the bearer was a surrendered soldier rather than a fugitive or a deserter. The printing of the paroles began that same day in the Clover Hill Tavern on a small army press. The press was operated around the clock and produced, within 2 days, most of the 28,000 paroles needed by the Confederates. Soon after their meeting, Grant left for Washington and a hero's welcome. Lee returned to his headquarters, passing again through his army amid a sea of gloom. Grant had been extremely generous with his surrender terms, but he felt it his duty to insist on a formal surrender parade during which the Confederates would relinquish their weapons, munitions, and battle flags, the symbols of resistance. A simple ceremony was scheduled for April 12th. The Union troops, a lone division, formed in the chill of that overcast April morning. Some perhaps thought of an April day exactly 4 years before, when an exploding shell above Fort Sumter signaled the beginning of the war, whose last chapter they were now helping to write. The troops lined both sides of the Lynchburg Road from the McLean House past the courthouse, beyond the triangle formed by the road intersection in front of the Pierce House, and onto the river in the valley below. By 9 o'clock, all was ready. The Federals watched as the depleted gray columns drew near the village from the hills to the east. There was a time, not long past, when the approach of this body of troops would have been met by shouted commands and the metallic clatter of ramrod and bayonet on barrel. This day, however, the muskets stood at the order, unthreatening, unneeded. The Confederates filed between the Union troops and faced left. They fixed bayonets and stacked their muskets. The color bearers then moved forward. Overcome by emotion, many Southerners wept as worn colors were placed on musket stacks. The men in blue stood in awed silence, profoundly affected by the scene unfolding before them. These soldiers of North and South had always felt a strange fraternalism, an attraction fused somehow by the fury of war. Each in his turn stood proud in defeat, humble in victory. And then it was over. The last march of the Army of Northern Virginia was history. Its soldiers left the village to hear their commander's affectionate farewell. And then, with little more than their paroles and their pride, they drew away. Singly or in small groups, they moved toward home. The men of the North soon followed, their measured tread a requiem for a fallen cause. But though the men of North and South parted here, in a larger sense, Appomattox had drawn them closer together. For born on the events of these last days was a heritage of peace. It sprang from Grant and Lee, from the ranks of blue and gray. It slowly moved into the hearts and minds of the people. For Americans all, they recognized a kinship that war could not sunder. At Appomattox, the nation was reborn, strong with future bright. Here, with generosity, honor, and compassion, the mending truly had begun.
Cleo.
Where's that tongue at?
Where's your tongue? Where's your tongue, Cleo? Cleo. Talk to me. off. Huh?
Uh-uh.
Yes. Hey!
B.
Cleo. Beady. Beady.
Downtown Abington. There's the boarding house. There's the Wolf Hills where we stayed last night. There's Anna and the Little Roo. We're here at the festival.
Okay. Sit down, sir.
Have you ever seen anybody take a bath like this before?